how about now? Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Dean, for being here. I'm so
Thank you.
looking forward
It's great to be here. I see so many people I haven't seen in a long time.
Thanks for giving us the time, Dean. I just was trying to think how to frame this, journalism and democracy. We live in a time when there is a deep crisis in local journalism, and that is very much the focus of the GroundTruth project. We have about 300 reporters in our Report for America program, and we have a really strong and growing Report for the World program that's trying to recognize that the crisis in local news is truly a global crisis. And that global crisis in local news is also a crisis for democracies around the world, including this one. So that framing is pretty exciting start to be able to talk with you, Dean. I think a question all of us would be wondering right off the top is, what's it like as you transition out of the editor's chair at the New York Times and you take on this amazing new challenge with the fellowship?
Can you hear me okay? The transitioning out, I have to say the first month was odd, because between being editor of the LA Times and running the Washington Bureau and then running the New York Times, you're always on. And I remember sitting up watching the January 6th hearings, just going out of my mind, because I kept wanting to send notes to people, and I realized that's not the way to transition out. So I just sent notes to myself and didn't do anything, and just drank a lot of tea. Because you can't. The late great John Carroll, who was my predecessor at the LA Times, gave me a great gift when he retired and I became editor, which was he left. He left lovingly. I mean, he remained my friend. We would have dinner together, and he would never critique the paper, and he would only say good things. So that's the way I've maintained my relationship with editors at the Times, even though I still work at the Times. So it's been tricky. I have to say, though, that once I got into the new venture, I really got excited. First off, I found myself reporting, which, as those of you who are editors know, you don't get to do very often. I found myself on the phone with editors across the country, just sort of asking them what they need, how they think about local journalism, how they think about investigative reporting, and it was terrific. It sort of opened my mind, because I realized I had been out of touch with medium-sized newspapers for a very, very long time, even though that's where I started, and it was just terrific, and humbling in a lot of ways too. Humbling, if I can say one thing, humbling because they're busting their asses. They do not like to be told that they live in news deserts, even though they acknowledge, of course, they do, because they want people to know they're like really working hard, and they are constantly working. I spent one long conversation with the editor of Mississippi Today, the new executive editor, who's like a 30-year-old guy from Mississippi, and I got off the phone with him, and I looked at their website, and he had 2 stories on it, you know. So it was humbling and exciting, and I learned a lot.
Those newsrooms that you're in and you're touring, or so many of them are our partners, and we're really proud, including Mississippi Today, to be able to support reporters there. But you're right, the challenges are extraordinary. And what I love about sort of imagining you on this investigative tour, going through the country, talking to these newsrooms, is just the incredible affinity you'd have with those newsrooms as a local reporter yourself. Times-Picayune, Chicago Tribune, and on the Metro desk of the New York Times. And I think I just wanted to say that that's a passion we share as local reporters in our roots and from the very beginning. And I want to just hear you talk a little bit about the importance of local journalism and as it relates to this moment we live in, when it really feels like journalism's under attack, democracy is even deeply strained.
You know, a lot of the debates that are going on nationally, how we conduct elections, how much democracy is under threat, a lot of those discussions are actually being played out on the ground around the country in local school board elections, in who gets appointed to be election officials in states. It's really much more, at least as evident, actually, on the ground outside of Washington and New York as any other place. And those editors and newsrooms are aware of it. They're significantly smaller. I mean, I I mean, I found this. I grew up in New Orleans, and I started at the Times-Picayune. It's hard to imagine this now, but the Times-Picayune at its height must have had a newsroom of 400 people, because two newspapers merged. And I remember thinking one of the other big local newsrooms was the Jackson Clarion Ledger. I think the present and former editors of the Jackson Clarion Ledger, who do great stuff, I think their newsroom is like less than 20 now. And Mississippi Today says they have the biggest newsroom in Mississippi now. So here they are. They have 3 or 4 giant obligations. One is they are supposed to cover on the ground what we are trying to cover as a national story, and that's hard. They are also supposed to do the things that big national papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, well, certainly the New York Times, don't do as much, which is like, which school in Queens should I send my kid to? And meanwhile, they're supposed to find time to come up with sort of larger enterprise. Mm-hmm. It just so happened I hit all of the Jackson papers and websites just before the water crisis. Just before the water crisis exploded, if you will, and they were all talking about it, their approaches to covering the water crisis. This was 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it was, again, it's inspiring. They are like really working hard. But they also all say they don't have a lot of time to like sit back and think, what's the largest way for us to confront this crisis? Because if you have a newsroom the size that I just described, actually covering the crisis is hard enough. And I mean, one of the things that I hope to bring to them is to give them a little bit of time to think about the larger story.
Seeing you in a newsroom is pretty exciting. We know you can be inspiring, and I think your presence there in a newsroom like Mississippi Today, or going out to some of the smaller newspapers that really are struggling, even though they're working, as you say, so hard. We know this because you've been so generous in speaking to our reporters who are glowing after you speak with them, and they have more energy than ever. So I'm so appreciative of your role as someone who's giving back. But I want to talk a little bit more about what you're going to do with the fellowship, and maybe hear a little bit more in detail. What does that look like? How can it be supportive of local journalism?
So here's how it started. It started a little bit vaguely, frankly, on purpose, because I did not want it to be completely crafted in the newsroom of the New York Times by editors, including me, who had not done local reporting themselves in a long time. So the original plan, which we've tinkered with now, was we would set up the fellowship. Reporters and news organizations from around the country would apply, and we'd pick 10 or 12 fellows. We'd pay their salaries. They would apply with an idea for a project. We would pay their salaries, and we would publish their work in the New York Times and in a local news organization too. But so we're still going to do that. But the one thing I heard talking to editors, which always proves to me the value of actually reporting as opposed to just editing, a lot of them said, look, we don't have time necessarily to craft project ideas. They also said, we need more flexibility. If you come to us and say, year-long fellowship, January to December, we don't know what that looks like. They also said that they were not 100% sure they had slam dunk projects. I know that because I've tried a lot of projects as a reporter and editor that didn't work out. So we tinkered with it a little bit. So besides the fact that we're going to take applications, me and some of my colleagues are going to hit the road and sit down in newsrooms and so far newsrooms have invited us to come in to do this, and just brainstorm a little bit and try to see if we can craft investigative projects from them. I mean, I would love to be able to sit down with a newsroom that's covering the Jackson water crisis and say, like, if you didn't have to worry with your newsroom of 16 or 20 about covering it day to day, if I could help you, and I say that with humility, having grown up in Louisiana but never having been to Jackson, if I could help you craft something larger, What's the best way for me to do that? So we're going to have the application process, but I'm also going to go into newsrooms and help them craft ideas. And we're going to be a little bit more flexible than we anticipated in terms of timing and length, because, you know, some projects take a year, some projects take 2 months, some projects are running projects, some projects are fully baked projects. So I think the main thing I heard from the editors was be flexible and work with us. So we're going to do that.
Great. It sounds really exciting.
No, it is. After speaking to all these editors, frankly, I was like, I went from mourning my past life to being excited about my future life. So.
Well, I think we're all excited about what you're going to do with this. I want to take a step back a little bit and just say that it doesn't surprise me at all that you're doing what we would call ground truth out there in the newsrooms to find out what they need, to really see what is needed there. It's a pretty simple phrase, but one that binds us together. Report for America, report for the world. It's all about being there on the ground to figure things out. It has a higher purpose, I think. It's the essence of good journalism. And you've done that your whole life before you were an editor, and even as an editor, as we're learning. But talk about what it was like, Chicago, City Hall, coming into New York, reporting here. What was the journey of local reporting like for you? Why is it exciting? Why is it a great adventure? And why is it so important right now that we restore it and we take good care of it?
So I started as a reporter, as a police reporter at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans when I left college, when I was 19 or 20. And I grew up in New Orleans. For those of you who've been there, it's a very parochial city. And I grew up in one part of New Orleans, sort of black working class New Orleans in the 7th Ward in Treme. I didn't know the other half of New Orleans. The first time, I'm going to admit to an ethical breach here, the first time I had to cover a fire in uptown New Orleans, I couldn't find it. And by the time I found it, the fire was long over. And I had to reconstruct it. I'm glad there was no internet or no live, because I've reconstructed it for the next morning's paper. But, you know, New Orleans came to life for me in a very different way. I met people and had to cover people I'd never, you know, covered before. I mean, I grew up, you know, frankly being taught to be wary of police. Suddenly I was covering cops. I had to deal with them. And the city just sort of came to life to me in a very, very different way. And also, frankly, I felt like I was having impact on a city that I really cared about. Chicago, so I worked as a reporter in New Orleans for about 5 or 6 years, eventually becoming one of the Picayune's investigative reporters. I went to Chicago to join their investigative team. It was the last gasp of the most competitive local news town I've ever been in my life. I've never seen anything like it. The Sun-Times was still strong. The Tribune was very strong locally. There were 3 television stations, each of which had an investigative team. Pam Zeckman was at the peak of her powers. And you couldn't, like, go to bed at night without figuring out who had what. I will also say, in terms of democracy, and partly for bad reasons, people care deeply about local news. When I say partly for bad reasons, it's because everybody knew who their alderman was, because the name of your alderman was on your garbage can. And so many people worked in the political machine that you cared who your alderman was. You cared, you know, who the city sanitation commissioner was. It was like the machine was so much a part of the political life of the city, and it was exhilarating to, like, compete. I had a conversation with one editor, and tell me if I'm droning on here. I had a conversation with one editor in the last couple weeks who said, you know, the one thing that we all miss a little bit is competition. And people sometimes speak ill of competition. They say, why don't you just all work together? Look, competition at its peak drove some of the finest journalism. I mean, I'm sure Woodward and Bernstein did not wake up every morning saying, how can we fix democracy? I think they woke up every morning thinking, how are we going to beat the New York Times? Which they did every day. So competition is a very powerful driver, and it was in Chicago. And then I moved to New York to join the Metro staff as I think I must have been the only investigative reporter on Metro then, and there were two investigative reporters at the Times, me and one person in the Washington Bureau. And New York Newsday was at the peak of its powers. If you remember what that was like, they outnumbered us in New York, and it was also exhilarating and scary. And obviously New York is not the competitive news landscape that it was then, but I mean, if you add it up, I know I'm mostly identified by the generation in the New York Times as somebody who's run a national news organization, but what I just described is a big chunk of my career, and also, frankly, a big chunk of how I learned to think about journalism, and also a big chunk of what I see as the kind of impact local news can have at its best.
Thanks. I just want to put a yellow highlighter on that experience in Chicago and the team you led that won the Pulitzer Prize for exposing corruption in that city council with those aldermen who everyone knew something about, but not enough, clearly. So that was amazing work. When you came to New York and you worked on the Metro desk here, I think that was in the early 90s, is that correct?
Yeah, early 90s.
So
1990,
So we literally were on the street together as reporters. I worked at the New York Daily News then.
Which was also...
Yeah, and I think the Daily News had
that's right.
the largest circulation. It had a huge team. It was so exciting to work there. And I loved what you said about competition. We would literally line up the papers at night, at midnight, down at the Lion's Head, and they would put the papers out, and you'd see who beat who, and there would be all of this competition. It was an amazing time of great journalism, but it also was a really flawed time. And I know you and I had a chance to talk a little bit, and I want to sort of go there about the strength of what it meant to be in a great newspaper war, which it was here in New York for sure in the early 90s. But also the terrible mistakes that were made, the ways we failed, the ways despite all the resources, we were not doing a great job covering the city. Maybe take a moment to reflect on that.
You know, I'll actually start with Chicago, which I've thought a whole lot about. In some ways, that Chicago newspaper war, I mean, it was investigative reporting at its best, but in some ways, there's a lot of stuff that I look back on that we didn't do as well. I don't think for instance, the transition from the traditional Chicago machine to Harold Washington, I don't think in the moment we understood how big a deal that was. And I don't think we quite figured out how to cover it. I think we struggled with how to cover it. I mean, we had, it was the first black mayor, obviously, and a dramatic shift in Chicago politics. And I think we didn't quite, I don't think we had it's hard when you're like driving daily journalism to have your eye on the larger narrative. And that was a pretty large narrative. That was a significant shift in the politics and the life of Chicago. And it was sort of in the back of my mind that was part of the story, but it was hard to make it part of the constant daily story. And I remember the day Washington died and going to City Hall and seeing the crowds outside of, I guess I don't remember if he was lying in state or if there was a memorial. It's a long time ago. To see the crowds outside City Hall. And I remember thinking, I understood something large happened, but man, something really large happened. And I don't think we were good at that. Newspapers, if I can say, newspapers, there are, to be a little bit, to be humble but also forgiving of newspapers. I mean, there is a hierarchy of journalism. And when I say hierarchy, I'm not talking about a qualitative hierarchy. I mean, there are institutions that have different obligations, and it was nobody that quite, I think, had its eye on the ball of the larger story of Chicago. We certainly did not.
I would say in New York at that time, it might have been one of the single greatest failings of those of us who covered cops and courts, and I was a police reporter. Central Park Jogger case was a failure to do ground truth, to do the hard work of getting out there, and the ways in which we were lied to by the prosecutors, by the police. It is certainly worthy of maybe more reflection than we've given it. There's a powerful documentary, a set of them actually. But I just think of that time, and I know you and I were talking about how it is so dangerous to romanticize a time, even though it was a time of Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill, and the streets were full of reporters at every scene, and the Gotti trials were really, they were pageantry and they were fun to cover, but there was a really, really distressing failure underneath that.
We should not romanticize. So I've worked, I've lost count, a lot of local news organizations. We shouldn't romanticize what they were.
Right.
I mean, we shouldn't. When I say the Times-Picayune had 400 reporters at its peak, we shouldn't assume that meant. Of course, there were many things it could do, but we shouldn't romanticize what news organizations were like. And frankly, not only Central Park Jogger, not only the romantic era of Chicago and New York in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the southern newspapers that I grew up reading didn't cover the South that I grew up in. So we shouldn't, I mean, newspapers, and I will use that phrase because I'm old, news organizations are inherently flawed. We should work really hard to make them better. We should own up to their flaws, but they have to be flawed, partly because of the speed, and there's nothing wrong with speed. I mean, news travels fast, but they're inherently flawed, and I think you're right. And frankly, I do think that we're only now coming to understand, like, covering police is a different matter than it was.
Right.
When I grew up, you went to a press conference. I mean, I remember this awful story. That's one of those stories you wish you could do better. New Orleans had a coroner, and this is only Louisiana. The coroner was a gynecologist. He was an elected coroner.
It's a pretty good lead.
I know. But, you grew up in the town. It's like, okay, if coroner's a gynecologist and he plays jazz. There were a couple of really terrible police cases that he sided with the police on that I only think we got to understand probably a beat too late, just because, you grew up in a world, unfortunately, where the coroner says, here's how the guy died.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, that, for me, becoming an investigative reporter was also involved started with covering a police story.
Right.
It was a revelation to me, and it changed me as a reporter. There was a police killing, and I won't go into all the details, but it became a national story in New Orleans. And I was a very different reporter by that time than the reporter who covered the coroner then.
Mm-hmm.
And we asked hard questions. We dug deep. We did investigative reporting. We treated the police with tremendous skepticism, and eventually the police were charged with a crime. And I think that was a very different kind of reporting, and I don't think I could have done it if I hadn't done, frankly, the screw-ups of my earlier days as a police reporter. I learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. As you look back and reflect now, like coming forward, how the New York Times is doing now covering local news, I think about having lived in this city, and I didn't have kids here, though, so I never watched the coverage of, for example, the Board of Education. If I were living in Queens, where am I going to get that coverage? Do we have enough local coverage in New York? There's some really exciting enterprises, the city and others that are coming along, but how is the New York Times doing covering local in this city?
I think the Times is good at the step-back investigative story. I think the Times is good at covering and has been very aggressive in covering the mayor. I don't think, and I don't think the New York Times would deny this, I don't think the New York Times is the place to go to figure out which school to send your kid to in Queens or Manhattan, for that matter. I think that, frankly, I'm not sure many newspapers do that well, and I think that's a hole in New York coverage. I mean, the New York Times made choices, I think necessary choices, everybody thinks of the New York Times as a thriving newspaper now, which it is. When I became editor 8 years ago, it didn't feel so thriving, frankly. We were doing buyouts, we were doing layoffs, we were cutting. And I think that the New York Times now is a very different newspaper than then, and it, of course, is not the place to find out which school to send your kids to. And I think we have to figure that out in New York as we have to figure it out everywhere, frankly.
Okay, I want to turn a little bit toward the international audience here. IPI has such a strong global membership, and I want to say my experience as a police reporter in New York City put me on the streets in 1993 with a loud bang, and it was the first World Trade Center bombing. And in that competitive newspaper war, all of us were all over that story, but I really was the first on the scene and stayed on that story. And I think how that local story, really digging on that local story, finding out who is Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, what is this organization that is coming together, nascent Al-Qaeda. It wasn't named that then, and we didn't see it maybe perfectly clearly, but we were on it. And the Daily News had enough funding to send me to Egypt and to send me to Sudan. It's sort of impossible to think of a local newspaper thinking that way these days. Right. But I think that connection between reporting locally and thinking globally is the essence of what Ground Truth is. And I know it's such a central part of your life. So I want to talk about that connection between local reporting in a global context. And how do we think about that for this audience?
So Azmat Khan, who is on the faculty here, who worked with us on a series of stories that won the Pulitzer Prize last year about drone strikes in Syria. When we first put together this team to do this, I did not know that Azmat had spent like 2 years being a local reporter. And it really was, I mean, this first meeting with Azmat, we put together this group after the drone strike in Afghanistan, where the U.S. had to acknowledge, after reporting, frankly, by the Times and the Post, that it was a bad strike that killed civilians. So we put together a meeting. The magazine brought Azmat, and I listened to her describe what she'd been doing and what she had, and it was like she was a local reporter. She did the on-the-ground, banging on doors, talking to people, talking to victims, talking to families, going to see the places where the strikes were, understanding that the U.S. conclusions about the strikes were completely wrong. And we married her reporting with the reporting from the people in the Washington Bureau. But I thought, man, I was listening to her describe it, and unfortunately on a Zoom call, because we were at that point in the pandemic, and it was like, I was levitating. I thought, my God, I'm listening to a highly sophisticated local police reporter who's describing the very best of on-the-ground journalism. And had she not done it, and had she not done the work, gone to the places, banged on the doors, the stories wouldn't have happened. And the U.S. just announced a couple of weeks ago that they're going to redo their program. That, to me, is the kind of local reporting that's missing. And it's missing in other places in the world, too. But that is like local police reporting writ large and sophisticated by a reporter playing at a very, very high level.
Anyone who's worked with Azmat in the field knows that is one of the great reporters for Ground Truth that is out there. Is Azmat here by any chance? Okay.
She just joined the staff of the New York Times, by the way, fully, officially.
I've had a chance to work with Azmat in Egypt during the Arab Spring, and same tactic.
And sorry. She's still a professor here. I want to get that.
So I want to just sort of say that sort of on-the-ground reporting, the way you do that. I had an experience recently in Ukraine, and being a reporter in Ukraine and hearing from some colleagues, some of whom might even be here, from Ukrainskaya Pravda, UP, other news organizations, but I was meeting with them in Ukraine, talking with them about how they're doing, and some of the theme that came up was what a crisis there is in local news in Ukraine in the years before Putin's invasion, and particularly in the Donbass, where the local news organizations were undercut, thwarted, weakened, and ultimately crippled, and that left a news desert in the Donbass into which toxic misinformation and disinformation soaks right into the soil, and we see that.
Right. Add China, add Iran, add North Korea. Those are places that loom large on the global stage that, frankly, we don't know a whole hell of a lot about on the ground.
And I think we're bound with countries like Ukraine, the ones you just mentioned, Brazil, India, Nigeria. This is where Report for the World, our program, is really trying to do a lot of work. And we're going to announce today that we're expanding the program. We're going to double it. We're going to go to 8 countries, and our colleague, our new global director, Preeti, who will be moderating, will share some news about that expansion of the program. But I want to really just give you a moment to close. We're right almost at time, and say, this local reporting crisis that is so global. We heard really great leaders in our industry with Osmot moderating yesterday. I think you could say concede that they don't know how to solve the problem of misinformation and disinformation. They're at a loss for where we go to get this done. And really good ideas were shared. But I want to ask you, is it possible local journalism will play that essential role in fighting misinformation and disinformation? And maybe just close us out with your thinking on that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer either, frankly. And anybody who comes in and says they know the answer now, I would say you should boo them off the stage. I don't know what the answer is. I will say a couple things. There's a lot of good stuff going on. It's too easy to pay attention only to traditional newspapers. There are a lot of amazing new startups all over the place. But when I set out to just try to, do interviews with people in Jackson, I was talking to, it wasn't just the Clarion Ledger. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a very aggressive young woman running the local black paper. There's Mississippi Today. There's another whole investigation operation run by Jerry Mitchell. There's just a lot of stuff going on. That's the first thing. The second thing, I want to make a plea. I think that one of the things that worries me the most about local journalism and frankly the future of journalism, I do think somehow we have stopped putting reporting at the front and center. Mm. I think that, frankly, I think the age we're in rewards quick takes and easy answers, and I promise you, the one thing I'm going into this with a tremendous amount of humility, but the one thing I will say is the answer does not lie in there. The answer lies in reporting and learning stuff and going out and trying to understand the world and going out with an open notebook and just talking to people. I mean, talking to all these editors was transformational for me, even though I lived in their world 20 years ago. Talking to them about the problem, understanding how it looks from where they sit, understanding they hate the phrase news desert, understanding what they're up against, and understanding how hard they're working and how much they believe in reporting. Oh man, that was exciting. So I don't know what the answer is. I do believe that the answer is going to have the word reporting attached to it. And I do think there's exciting stuff going on, and we should not forget how much of that's going on. So,
thank you, Dean.
Thanks
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Dean.